In this question, we are going to assume that a constant tax on each unit of the good equal to 30 is levied on consumers. And then what we should do is we should analyze how that affects the equilibrium. Now, note two things. First of all, it says that the tax is a constant tax. Sometimes it's also called a specific tax. Now, what that just means is that the tax corresponds to a fixed amount per unit of the good. In the specific case here, 30. So if we're in Denmark, it corresponds to 30 kroner being paid, collected in tax per unit of the tax. Sorry, per unit of the good. Now, the reason why that's important is that there is another type of tax which is called a value tax or an ad valorem tax. And in that case, the tax is a constant percentage, a constant fraction of the price. An example in Denmark, for instance, could be the value added tax, momsen, which is 25% of the price. In that case, you don't know how much the tax measured in kroner will be until you know the price. If, for instance, the price before the value-added tax is 100 kroner, then the value-added tax will be 25 kroner, 25% of 100 kroner. If the price before value-added tax is 500 kroner, then the value-added tax will be 125 kroner, namely 25% of the 500 kroner. So with a value-added tax, you don't know before knowing the price what the actual kroner amount, the actual amount of the tax will be. Whereas with a constant tax, you know it because the tax is a constant amount per unit of the good. And that's the case we've got here, which is the case that you get in 99% of all problems. The second thing you should note here is that it says in the text that the tax is levied on consumers. Now, what on earth does that mean? And the answer is that means that it is now the responsibility of consumers, after having bought the good, to drive or walk for that matter past the tax authorities and then pay to tax authorities 30 kroner per unit of the good that the consumer has bought. In other words, it's the responsibility of consumers to actually hand over the tax amount to tax authorities. The alternative would be that it's the responsibility of producers, in which case we would say that the tax is levied on producers. But here it is levied on consumers. Now, how then do we go about doing this? And the answer is we do that by making a sketch. And you don't have to hand in that sketch, if you aren't asked to do it, and we haven't been, but it's a good idea to make a sketch, and you can do it if you want to inside your head, but I'm going to do it on the whiteboard because otherwise you can't see it. And in that sketch, we then initially draw the original equilibrium. And it just has to be a sketch, it doesn't have to be in any way accurate. But let's draw the original equilibrium. Then we found in the question before that at the original equilibrium, by that I mean before the tax is introduced, there is an equilibrium quantity equal to 30. Let's call it Q1. And there is an equilibrium price equal to 70. And then you put yourself in the shoes of consumers, because now the tax is levied on consumers. And then you say to yourself, how would I react as a consumer if I was told that in this market, I don't know what the good is, but that's also not important, but if in this market where I shop, I'm being told that as of tomorrow, a tax has been introduced, and meaning that I, after having bought the goods, will have to pay an additional, beyond what I pay at the shop when I buy it from the firm, I have to pay an additional amount equal to 30 kroner. How would I then react? And what you're supposed to react or think is that what that means is that you will now, when buying the good as of tomorrow, when the tax has been introduced, you will now have to buy whatever amount you want to buy, but only at a price which is 30 less than what you were willing to buy it for today. And what that corresponds to from a graphical point of view here is the demand curve shifting down. And please note, it's important that you think down by 30 kroner. Why should it be down? And the answer is because down is something with vertical, and on the vertical axis we've got the price. So if you are now only willing to buy the good when you buy it from the firm at a price which is 30 kroner less than yesterday, then it corresponds to the demand curve shifting down here by 30 kroner, because it simply means that whatever quantity you choose here, you will now want to pay only 30 kroner less than you were before the tax was introduced. The reason why I stress it is sometimes people say, when I ask them, what happens to demand? And then people say, demand shifts to the left. And of course, you could think in that way that it shifts to the left, because if it shifts downwards, you could think that it shifts to the left. However, the economic interpretation of it shifting to the left is that consumers now want to buy fewer goods. That's problem number one. Problem number two is, if I then ask you, and I will, how much does it shift to the left? Then most of you will not be able to answer that question, and we need to know how much it shifts. As a consequence of that, it's not a very good idea to think that it shifts to the left. It's not wrong, it's just not a good idea. It's a much better idea to think that it shifts downwards, because that can readily be seen as consumers now wanting to pay less for the goods. And we can also say exactly how much less they want to pay. They want to pay the tax less. That means it shifts down by 30. And then we write that the tax will shift demand down by T equaling 30, the tax equaling 30, to D prime. And please note, I'm going to finish the sentence. So there isn't a period yet. Then how are we going to find the equilibrium? And the answer is we're going to find the equilibrium where the new demand curve here intersects supply. And we've done that before. We did that in question 1. It's a simple matter of equating the right-hand sides of demand and supply and solving the resulting equation. However, there is a slight problem here. The slight problem is that we haven't got an equation telling us what the new demand curve is. So that is our job. We have now to find the equation for the new demand curve. How do we do that? And the answer is we look at the original demand curve. Specifically, the original inverse demand curve, which was P equaling 100 minus Q. The point is that what that tells us is that the original demand curve here, since we've got P on the left-hand side of the equality sign and on the vertical axis of the in the diagram, what that then tells us is that this constant here corresponds to the vertical intercept, and it tells us that this invisible one over here corresponds to the slope of the demand curve, the original demand curve, or -1 to be specific. Also, please note, if you haven't got inverse demand, that means with price isolated on the left-hand side, you first need to fight inverse demand, because you need, if you want to be able to read off the vertical intercept and the slope, you need to have the same variable on the left-hand side as the one you've got on the vertical axis. And this is an instance of what I was talking about previously in one of the introductory videos, that you don't always need to know the vertical intercept and the slope, but there are cases where you do, and this is one of those cases. But back to the story. By looking at the original demand curve, we can find the vertical intercept, we can find the slope, and having realized that this will shift down by 30, no matter where we are, we can conclude that the new demand curve must have the same slope as the original one, in other words, -1. At the same time, we can conclude, if it has shifted down by 30, that if the original vertical intercept was 100, the new vertical intercept must be 70, which of course then means that my sketch is wrong, because these two should be the same, but that's not really the point, it's just a sketch. And that then means that the equation for the new demand curve can be written directly, because what's the equation for a straight line which has a vertical intercept equal to 70 and a slope equal to -1? And the answer is it's P equaling 70 minus Q. So the point is, where these 70, in other words, is 100 minus 30. The point is that if you can just figure out, and you should write it, that it shifts down by the tax, and if you can find the original inverse demand, reading off that the vertical supply and the slope, then you can write down immediately, and you don't have to give any explanations because you're just supposed to see this. You can write down immediately the equation for the shifted demand curve. Then we can find the intersection, we can find the equilibrium. And we should write that we do it. We should write here that the equilibrium is found where the new demand curve d prime, please note prime doesn't mean I've differentiated, I just need to be able to call it something so that I can distinguish it from the d, where d prime and s intersect. And then for those of you who have forgotten, the supply curve, the inverse supply curve equation was P equaling 10 plus 2Q. So now we simply take the right-hand side of the supply curve expression and the right-hand side of the new demand curve expression and equate those. 70 minus Q equaling 10 plus 2Q. Then we get one equation in one unknown, which we solve. This time I will let you do it yourself. We get 60 divided by 3, that's 20. So apparently the tax will cause a decrease found at the intersection of the supply curve and the new demand curve, corresponding to Q equaling 20. Then we need to find the prices. And mark my words. We don't need to find the price because there is now not one price, there are two prices. And the reason for why there are two prices is now that after the introduction of the tax, there is a difference between what consumers pay in total. That means both what they pay when they buy from the firm and in addition to that, the tax. There is a difference between that, the total amount that consumers pay, and then what producers receive. Because of course, consumers receive only the part that they are paid directly from consumers. That means the part which is not including the tax. And as a result of that, we now have to operate with two taxes. We have to operate with the so-called consumer price, which is what consumers pay in total. And we have to operate with the so-called producer price, which is the price that producers, firms receive and get to keep. And there are many different ways of finding these two prices, the consumer and the producer price. And if each of you know and have learned a method which works for you, then by all means, just stick to that. I like to use the following method. The reason why I like it is that it always works. So it means you have to learn only one. But there are other methods, as I said. So if you have learned a method that works for you, just stick with that. But I use the following method. I say that when we now want to find the consumer price, that means the price paid by consumers in total, then we find it is found from, and then I write here in a parenthesis, original demand. And please note, it has to be original demand, or rather original inverse demand. In other words, what you now do is you take your inverse demand curve up here and then you simply plug in the quantity. And if you do that, we will get here 100 minus Q, and we found Q to be 20. If you plug that in, you get 80, and then we put a superscript C here on it, C for consumer. And the only reason why I make it red is for you to pay attention to it. Then, having found the consumer price, we need to find the producer price, and the producer price is found from, and here I write again, although it's a bit superfluous here, but I do it, I write original supply, or rather inverse supply. In other words, what we do is we take the inverse supply curve here, saying that P is equal to 10 plus 2 times Q, and then you plug in the quantity, which is 20. and that gives you 2 times 20, that's 40, plus 10, that's 50. And then we put in a superscript P here, P for producer. And what you should then note here, you don't necessarily have to tell anybody, but what you should then note here is that the difference here between the consumer price of 80 and the producer price of 50 is exactly equal to the tax. And that is exactly as it should be. But as I said, you don't necessarily have to write that as part of the solution. I would do it personally, but you don't have to. But for your own sake, please check it. Please check that if you take the consumer price, subtract the producer price, in the specific case, take 80, subtract 50, you get 30, which is equal to the tax. And the reason why you should check it is that if you don't get that difference, then you've made a calculational error. Now, 2 more things. In principle, we have finished here. So in principle, we have now finished answering question 2. We have calculated the effect of a tax levied on consumers. We have found that the quantity drops from 30 to 20. We have found that the producer price drops from 70 to 50, and that the consumer price increases from 70 to 80. But 2 things. First of all, why do I like this method? And the answer is I like this method of finding the producer and the consumer prices because I think it's easy to remember. It's easy to remember that whenever you want, in the presence of a tax, whenever you want to find the consumer price, then you find it by simply plugging in the quantity in equilibrium into the curve which is related to consumers. In other words, the demand curve. You just have to remember that if the demand curve has shifted, as it has in this case, you should use the original demand curve. Likewise, when you want the producer price, then you plug in the quantity into the curve which is related to producers, in other words, the supply curve. And then you have to remember if it has shifted, it hasn't shifted here, but we shall see shortly that it might shift. If it has shifted the supply curve, you should use the original one. In other words, it's easy to remember this method. Plug in the quantity into the curve related to consumers, that gives you the consumer price, into the curve related to producers, that gives you the producer price, and if one of the curves has shifted, and it will have, use the original curve. The other thing I want to say is that what have we done here when we insert into the demand and supply curves? What do we do graphically? And the answer is, well, graphically, when I plug in the quantity here into the original demand curve, it really corresponds here at a quantity of 20 to move upwards onto the demand curve. And then in here, I'll just wipe this out, I find the consumer price. In other words, in here we've got the 80, which we found by plugging in. Once again, it doesn't fit because this is just a sketch. But the basic principle is to take the quantity, plug it into the original demand curve that corresponds to starting at a quantity of 20, moving upwards onto the demand curve, and then reading off on the p-axis the price. What does it correspond to when you find the producer price? And the answer is that corresponds to taking the quantity, moving upwards onto the supply curve, and then in here on the price axis, you can then read off the producer price, P2P. And now you will also see why the method works, why the method necessarily produces a difference between the consumer and producer price, which corresponds to the tax. Because the difference when you plug in the 20 of moving up onto the original demand curve and the supply curve is exactly the vertical distance between those 2 curves, which corresponds to by how much you have shifted the demand curve downwards, in other words, by 30. So unless you have made a calculational error somewhere, you will get, by using this method, a difference between the consumer and the producer price equal to 30. And that concludes the question.